Welcome to Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape Podcast. Hosted by Dr. Holly Krutka, Executive Director of the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. The show highlights SER's role supporting our mission to promote energy-driven economic development for the state of Wyoming.
Okay, so welcome back to our listeners. Today, we'll be talking about risks around global energy changes and the global energy transition. So welcome, Dr. Skip York. Thank you so much for being here with us today. You have built a long and impactful legacy through an impressive career at the intersection of economics and energy. And it's just incredible to hear you talk big picture. And so I'm really grateful we get to share that with our listeners today. We're also so proud to call you a UW alum. Can you start by telling us a little bit about your time at UW and how you became interested in both economics and energy?
Oh, sure. No problem. I'm glad to be here, Holly. I mean, you and I have had these great conversations over the last years. I'm glad we're going to get to share this with your audience today because we always end up going places where I didn't anticipate us going. And that's what makes them fun. And that's kind of the story of my career. I came to UW as a physics major, and after a year, it just clearly didn't sing to me. It just didn't click. But I'd always been interested in economics, so I walked across Prexy's pasture, changed my major, and that's where the journey began. Then where economics and energy started to interface was, there's just a lot of natural resource economics content and professors and faculty here. And that's where I started to get exposed to the natural resources economics in general. And then naturally, a lot of that has to do with energy. And that's just kind of where the background started. Then I went on to do my doctorate at the University of Virginia. And I was planning to be a professor in economic development.
Really?
That's what my plan. That's why I went to UVA and went through the program. And then when I was on the job market and interviewing with a lot of places, I said, I'm just going to cast a broad net. I still thought I was going to be a college professor, but ended up joining Exxon just because it turned out to be of all the opportunities I had, it was the most interesting one. And then that's where I got into energy. And I discovered at Exxon that, I have this passion for energy because it tends to be so long dated. You have to make decisions that you're going to live with for 20 or 30 years. And I just find that fascinating. And then that just led me into my second passion of around strategy by making the right decisions and understanding you're going to have to live with them. So you really have to be prudent. And prudent doesn't mean slow. It means being prudent.
Mm-hmm. So. That's great. And I think it's a good lesson to students because I was convinced I would never be in academia. And here I am. So just follow where your career goes. Follow your passion. So let's talk about energy and the conversation on energy. How has that changed, particularly the national and global discussion on what's called the energy transition, which essentially means changing out energy sources to reduce emissions?
I think the conversation's kind of changed and it's evolved probably over the last 20 years. I think it's a bit of the boiling frog where people don't notice that the conversation's changed because it's so incremental. When I came into the industry, the conversation around energy was around availability and affordability. How do we make it available to people at the most affordable price you can make it? And that was not only for advanced countries, but that was how developed countries are. Because what we do know about economic development is that energy per capita is the key lever. If you can't increase energy per capita, it is very difficult, if not impossible, to pull countries out of abject poverty. So that was the conversation, sort of call it the 80s and the 90s. And in the 90s, it started to change and started to add the dimension of sustainability. Sustainability not in the sense that we talk about it today, but sustainability in the sense of really in two factors. One, the industry really started to get very focused on safety. So we wanted a sustainable operations. We wanted operations where people came home at night to their families. And that was a shift in the mental model. Operating model that happened in about that time frame. And we started to get into the environmental discussion. It was about how do we shrink the environmental footprint? And the issue of the day, I think what really started us on down that environmental path was concern about sulfur dioxide, especially in the Midwest. And then it was the ozone. CO2 and climate change are just they're just the next chapters of that sustainability story that the energy industry has been grappling with for the last 30 years.
Yeah. So when you came to UW in 2023, you talked about the 2022-2023 global energy crisis. So how are modern energy crises different from those historically?
I think the big change that we saw in 2022, and that I think will repeat itself going forward, is historically energy crises have been more localized. It was a coal crisis in the UK in the 1940s, or, it was the power crisis in California in 2021. The first, probably the only global energy crisis that we had really up until 2022 was the OPEC embargo and the oil price shock of 1973. Most of them were localized, and what they all had in common was, and today, what all energy crises have in common is that the prelude to that crisis tends to be a fairly rapid erosion of either spare production capacity, either intentional or unintentional. In the case of OPEC countries intentionally taking oil supply off the market, and either the erosion of that capacity and the rapid drawing of inventories. And that's what we saw in 2022 with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. It wasn't so much that crude oil production came offline or that refineries shut down. It was that as the sanctions came into place, in the order to keep the world supply, we had to reorder where ships were moving. And what that did is we had to draw down existing inventories, and we had ships on the water, which effectively drew down tightened up the supply chains as well. I think what we saw in Ukraine is going to be a characteristic of energy crisis going forward. I think they're now going to become more globalized in nature, partly because just the infrastructure is already so tight globally. But the other part of it is, you globalize the economy over 20 or 30 years.
Right.
All of a sudden, what happens on one side of the world has an impact on the other side of the world. And that's just going to be one of the consequences of a more global society.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Globalization also was maybe a bit of like what was your analogy? A frog or a toad in water?
The boiling frog.
Boiling frog.
Yeah.
Because there is an opportunity with globalization to lift people out of poverty from around the world. But there are also some unintended consequences. And gosh, COVID really laid that all out for us to see.
And COVID really sort of exposed, not for better or for worse, but COVID really exposed how dependent supply chains had become, or how globalized they'd actually become. And I think we kind of drifted into it. And I think we're now starting to step back, not just in the U.S., but I think around the world. I think countries are stepping back saying, okay, not every supply chain needs or should be globalized.
Right.
We do need some for national or for energy security reasons. We do need something that's a bit more geographically contained than what we had. And I think we're now starting to see that those supply chains are still reordering themselves. We're almost 4 years past COVID now, and those supply chains are still reordering themselves.
Right. So are we in a global energy crisis now?
So I think we're on the verge, or we're at a tipping point. And it's not a production crisis. Where I think the crisis is coming is more around infrastructure and logistics. It's not that we have a crisis in producing oil or gas, coal, uranium. It's the infrastructure that it takes to move it from the producing point to the consumer. That infrastructure is getting so tight and it is getting so worn that we might be able to produce it, but we can't get it there. So are we in a crisis? No. Ukraine was an energy crisis, or 2022 was an energy crisis. What it showed us was how quickly you can adapt, trade flows can adapt and rebalance the world. But it did that at making the supply chain even tighter. I mean, we've got fewer vessels on the water, but they're on the water for longer periods of time. We averted, I think, another crisis last fall as the Houthi rebels started to attack vessels in the Red Sea. It's the signpost of what could happen. And I'm not sure that people are really taking that signpost in and really absorbing it the way they should. But I think my concern is we're at a tipping point. And all it takes now is that it's just, it's that one more straw that breaks the camel's back. And I hope there's not this false sense of security that because we adapted so quickly in 2022, I hope policymakers and producers and consumers aren't in this false sense of security that we can always just adapt that quickly, because we chewed up a lot of excess infrastructure capacity in order to rebalance in 2022, and it hasn't been replaced yet. So it's going to be incrementally harder to, if we continue to have disruptions, we're just going to put more and more strain on the infrastructure. My worry is we're about there. And the next time something happens in the world, the next event could be the event that sets us up. And I think, and it's a bit more prolonged because it's not only about realigning trade patterns, it's about getting capacity in place for those trade patterns to realign. I mean, Lord help us if the flare-up between Iran and Israel, if that turns into a regional hotspot and for some way the Straits of Hormuz shuts down, Lord help the global economy, because that's where about 10% of the world's oil supply comes through about a 35-mile strait that sits off the southern coast of Iran and the northeast coast of Saudi Arabia. No sign that the Iranians intend to do that, but that's always been a flashpoint in the global oil market, and I think the risk profile of something happening there is much higher now than I've ever seen it.
On that note, let's get back to this topic of energy transition. So you gave an example in your talk that essentially humanity has made one successful energy transition. What was that?
Yeah, so it's the I'm gonna plagiarize an executive from Shell, who was the executive that ran the upstream a number of years ago. He opened a presentation at a conference by saying that the energy transition started with the discovery of fire and it hasn't stopped since. And he's true. We went from burning manure to burning wood to burning coal to burning oil to burning gas to nuclear reactors, and now we're into the renewable space. We've been transitioning since humanity rose up and started scratching on cave walls. The example I gave of all those energy transitions, though, they've all, with the exception of one, they've all been additive.
Right.
Meaning that we actually burn more manure, which we politely call biomass now. We burn more manure and more wood today than at any point in history.
Right.
The one exception, the one energy source where we actually have bent the demand curve and turned it over and reduced the demand is whale oil. And we were able to reduce whale oil because an alternative came up, and that alternative was kerosene. And kerosene came out of crude oil, was the big cut coming out of crude oil when we first started refining crude oil in the late 19th century. That presented a substitute that allowed us to reduce the use of whale oil in heating and in lamps. And so in a very real sense, as much as the oil industry gets disparaged by a lot of voices, in a very real way, the oil industry saved the whales because we were hunting whales to extinction for their blubber.
Right.
And that substitute, that alternative, allowed us to as a society, allowed us to make a different choice.
I think that's such a great example. And I think it's really important for folks when you go out and look at information on global energy consumption. One of the interesting things is you can see graphs that might make you think we are in an energy transition moving toward renewables. But to your point, actually, if you non-dimensionalize and you say this is 100% of our energy consumption, yeah, it looks like it's changing. But if you actually look at the amount of energy being consumed, we're just adding on new energy sources, almost nothing. We have not, despite what you read, we have not globally hit peak coal, right? And that's right. Something that almost in some conversations or some circles seems to be a given, like coal's on the decline. It's not. And so it shows you the world continues to be very hungry for energy, but it is good news for all of us that we were able to transition away from whales. So.
Well, and I think we will continue. That transition continues with any like emission footprints or environmental footprints. And Holly, you and I have talked about is that I'm really hoping that at some point the energy transition discussion, first of all, it turns from an argument to a debate, from a debate to a discussion, and the discussion is around the environmental footprint, not focusing on just one environmental element being CO2. Because my worry is, we get 30 or 40 years down the road and we've made a series of decisions to mitigate CO2 emissions and a whole bunch of other environmental consequences have arisen that now need to be addressed by the decision makers in the 2040s and the 2050s. Yeah, I think we're heading towards a path of we're going to get more diversified. I think that's one of the things that Ukraine showed to me was let's not be overly dependent. I think Europe had been warned for years about how exposed they were to Russian gas flows. And then they got a real world example of that, what happens with the lack of diversification. So one of the things that diversifying your energy mix does, it provides more energy security because it diversifies the number of sources of supply. The other thing about that is that not everywhere on the planet can have the same energy portfolio.
Right.
Different parts of the world have different energy endowments. So let's not try and have a one-size-fits-all solution to whatever objective we're trying to meet. If it's net zero in 2050, let's not assume that every corner on the planet has to have the exact same energy mix. There are going to be different resource endowments and different stages of energy and economic development. And so let's not be surprised that different parts of the world are going to have different solutions in place.
Or even different parts of the country. I think we're going to feel a lot different here in Wyoming than folks on the West Coast might feel. But that doesn't mean we can't meet environmental goals. So when you came here in 2023, you said that COVID and other changes had reduced the shouting and improved the global discussion on energy. Do you still believe that?
I do still believe it. I think the conversation's becoming more civilized. I think the conversation's becoming more mature. I think it's becoming more realistic. Are there still people who like to stand on the sidelines and shout foul things about people who disagree with them? Sure there are. But I think it's a lot less of that rhetoric. We see a lot less of that rhetoric than we did 4 years ago, than 2 years ago. I mean, you saw at the latest COP meeting in the Middle East, you saw a much more balanced discussion. It was still very rigorous. There were still people who had strong disagreements with some of the things that were being discussed. But there were issues on the table at that COP meeting that were not allowed to be discussed in Glasgow.
Right.
In the previous COP meeting. And I think if we're serious about transitioning the energy system, and if we're serious about, reducing the environmental footprint of not just of energy, but of society as a whole, if we're serious about that, then the conversations are going to have to get more serious. And I think we've seen that. One of the things I think that surprised people, and I'm largely saying, I think I'll call it the opponents of the oil and gas industry. I don't know how else to put it. I think one of the things that surprised them about COVID was we essentially shut down the global economy and oil demand only went down 10%.
Right.
So I think that was one of those proof points of this is just how big the problem is and how long it takes to actually transition that problem. You're moving a ship that is, it just turns very slowly. One of the silver linings of COVID is that we got to see just how hard it is to really squeeze hydrocarbons out of the energy mix because there just aren't a lot of viable substitutes.
Right. I mean, I think we all changed our life cycles and the total impact was pretty small, honestly. So that it also shows you just how strong the demand, even with a total lifestyle change where most people aren't going to work anymore. We're not flying all over the place. We're not going on vacations. And yet we still used a lot of oil, gas, everything.
I think I was in the minority, and I think the consensus in late 2020 and early 2021 was that oil demand had peaked, that COVID had broke the back.
Oh, gosh.
And I was the one who kept saying, no, it's because eventually the only way that oil demand has peaked is if we believe that the global economy isn't going to recover. And what we've seen is that oil demand did recover. 22 and 23 were some of the strongest years in terms of oil demand growth that we've seen in the last 20 to 30 years. Now, a lot of that is still recovery, still coming out of, the COVID recovery. And if that's now kind of completed itself in 2024, then we would expect oil demand growth to still be positive, but at a slower rate than we saw in 22 and 23.
Yeah. So something I've heard you say before is that oil is less concentrated than minerals. So when you talk about energy, it's not just about the fuels. There's a lot of other minerals and materials needed to convert those fuels, or wind or solar or hydro or uranium, to usable forms of energy. So can you explain what you mean by that and the implications for energy, especially in a changing energy mix?
Yeah, so I think I'll take a step back and say, let's just do an energy transition primer 101, which is if you're going to transition from the traditional energy mix, the energy mix we have today, which is about 80% hydrocarbons, coal, oil, and gas. If you're going to transition away from those traditional energy fuels, you're going to do that by changing processes that now use heat. You're going to transform them or transition them to energy forms that use electricity.
Got it.
Now, gas has sort of both purposes. It can both be sort of a thermal heating agent. It can also be used to generate electricity. Coal is predominantly for electricity.
Right.
So we're going to try and figure out how do we stop? How do we use less coal? But as you're going through that transition, you're now electrifying things. And electrification has a different material mix than the current energy system does. And it largely pivots around a number of critical minerals. But the four biggest ones are copper, nickel, cobalt, and lithium. And there are some other minerals in there. All of those new energies, trying to electrify things, electric vehicles, from using coal to the green steel of using DRI and using hydrogen, they all use more of those minerals than the traditional source does. So as you're thinking through the energy transition, you have to think about not only the risk profile of oil and gas, but also the risk profile of the materials you're going to need to transition away from them. And so that's a long introduction to saying we often talk about the concerns people have about the concentration and the political risk of oil, because a third of the world's oil supply sits in the OPEC countries. That's where the greatest concentration is. Now, U.S. shale, the doubling of U.S. production from 6 million barrels a day in 2007, 2008, to 13 million barrels a day today, that has diversified that supply stack a little bit, but it's still predominantly an OPEC-driven supply stack. And those countries sit in less politically stable parts of the world. So we've always been concerned about a lot of the oil supply being in the hands of a few countries, and those countries tend to be less politically stable. If you look at those other energy transition minerals, copper, cobalt, nickel, lithium, they're all more concentrated than oil, and they're all concentrated in countries that are actually less politically stable than the Middle East countries. So one of the risks we have to think about is as we transition away from oil and gas and we're becoming more dependent on those minerals, how are you going to mitigate that market risk of the concentration? And also, how are you going to mitigate that geopolitical risk? Because if you don't do those two things and that mineral supply chain seizes up, now all of a sudden your objective of meeting net zero by 2050 is at risk because you don't have the materials you need in order to transition. And we're not having that discussion yet. If I had a magic wand, that's the wand I would wave. If I could rub a genie and get one wish, my wish would be, can we start talking about that market and geopolitical risk now before we start making commitments to things that later on we're going to say, now we're stuck in a corner solution because we didn't develop alternatives to the path that we were on because we weren't thinking holistically about risk. We were focused on one singular risk, and we took on a lot of other risks that we didn't anticipate because we weren't looking at the broader picture.
And so when you're saying you're really talking about globally, the global community that has agreed to international agreements, Paris Agreement, saying that we're going to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I think the point you're making is that we're not doing this in a really robust way. So we are causing risks for ourselves that we might not be fully understanding. And by the way, is that really what you would use your one genie wish on? Think about that. Don't have to answer that. So can you talk about the economics, and you're starting to touch on this already, but the economics of global oil production versus global, what you call clean energy, or is that limited to renewables, or what do you mean by clean energy?
So clean energy is more than just the renewables because you could have an infinite number of windmills sitting in a location, but if they're not connected to a transmission grid to move those electrons to an end-use place, you really don't have a green solution. You haven't really transitioned.
Right.
So when I talk about clean energy, it's about it's not only a smaller environmental footprint energy source, but also the investment in the infrastructure necessary to get that energy to where the end users need it, to where consumers are.
Got it.
So we look at that whole you need to look at that entire value chain, because until you get all the way from the clean energy source, the solar plant or the wind farm, all the way to the end consumer, you haven't solved a problem yet. So the value chain solves the entire problem. Now, if you look at it, oil and gas investment sort of peaked in 2014. And, you could argue that in 2012 and 2013 that the oil industry was spending like drunken sailors and deploying a lot of capital that didn't need to be deployed, and then rue the day in 14 and 15 when the chickens came home to roost. But we've kind of peaked out. Even here we are in 2024, and even with the service inflation that we've seen from 2021 really to today, globally, we're still spending less. The industry is still spending less than it was in 2014. Clean energy is, and I think most people don't realize this, is that if you think of clean energy being that entire infrastructure system, clean energy investment globally is about $1.5 trillion compared to $500 billion for the oil industry. So we're spending 3 times as much in clean energy as we are in the conventional hydrocarbon space. So the first thing people need to realize is that at $1.5 trillion, we're about $2 trillion per year short.
And we're investing how much in oil? 500 million? Or 500 billion? Sorry.
500 billion.
Wow.
So if you wanted to be net zero by 2050, globally, you need to be investing about $3.5 trillion a year in clean energy globally. And we're doing 1.5. So we're $2 trillion a year short on
and
that
less
investment.
than half.
We're doing less than half. And every year, that $3.5 trillion is going to go up because you didn't spend the $3.5 trillion this year. So the total amount of investment you need, and you got fewer years, that number, that investment curve gets steeper. But we'll park that to the side. The first thing is that this notion that, if the oil industry would just stop investing in oil and gas and invest in renewables, we would be on a pathway to net zero. No, we would be halfway to a pathway to net zero. We'd still be, over $1 trillion short. Now, we've seen in rapid increases in that clean energy investment, but it's started to plateau the last couple of years. And we're now starting to run into, for a combination of reasons, but we're starting to see still growth in that clean energy investment, but the rate of investment is starting to slow because the economics are getting more and more adverse. What we're discovering is that they are low return projects, and they tend to be with rising interest rates. The rate of return that you can earn on a clean energy project, broadly speaking around the world, there are exceptions, but broadly speaking, is below the cost of capital that they can access. And I don't think anybody believes we're going back to a zero interest rate environment like we saw pre-2022.
That would be my genie wish.
Go back to zero interest rates?
Yeah, that was great. Just kidding. There was some downside to that. Yeah. So right now you're just talking kind of about oil and clean energy investment. And I think this is a really key point. But I do want to emphasize that here in Wyoming, I think we do feel when we say clean energy, we think we can do coal with carbon capture clean. We can do gas with carbon capture clean. And I'll tell you, if there's one place, at least in the US, that coal to hydrogen would work, it would be right here in Wyoming. But let's think globally and compare. You've made this comparison between investment in oil and investment in this clean energy infrastructure system. So we are now in a situation where we have growing global demand for energy. We have declining investment in oil and plateaued investment in clean energy. So what does that mean?
We started the conversation around an energy crisis.
Right.
We are setting the table for an energy crisis that, is it a 2024, 2025 event? Probably not. But you get out 5, 6, 7 years into the future, and all of a sudden, energy demand is still growing. The traditional fuels have plateaued in their production because they're investing to sustain production, not grow production, broadly speaking. And we've plateaued on the clean energy side. So there's this energy deficit, whether it's a hydrocarbon molecule that's providing the energy or if it's an electron that's providing the energy. Globally, we could see ourselves we're just short. Now we get into that crisis mode of if we're short any commodity, what we know about any commodity, whether it's energy or agriculture, price solves any crisis. And what I mean by that is if there's more demand than there is supply for a commodity, prices adjust, and in commodity spaces, they adjust fairly rapidly. And consumers are really uncomfortable with that volatility.
Right.
But that's how commodity prices solve themselves. Now you step back and say, not only do we have to live with these investments, are they long-dated investments? If I make an investment today in any energy system, I'm making an investment in an asset that's going to be around for 20 plus years. It's also going to take me 5 to 7 years from when I make the investment decision until I start getting production from that investment. It's not an oil issue. It's the same thing for solar and wind farms.
Yep.
Yes, you can build the solar farm faster than you can do a deep water oil project. But then you come back to the transmission issue. And the real issue that we've got some significant transmission backlogs in the southwest part of the United States where we're building the wind farms and we're building the solar farms. And we're not clear that we're going to be able to connect them to the grid because the transmission investments are lagging. So we could have a lot of productive capacity sitting around and no way to get it to market. The concern is you need to recognize that risk now and then hope that the crisis doesn't show up for 4 to 5 years.
Right.
Because if it takes you 4 to 5 years to do any of these energy investment projects and get them to completion, you need to make that pivot now and then hope that we can muddle through with the existing capacity for 4 to 5 years before that new effective capacity comes online. That's one of the areas that the greatest fear as an economist that I have is that we're going to be forced to say economically who gets to grow and who doesn't.
Right.
And that says who gets to improve their standard of living and who doesn't. And I don't think, and I consider myself I'll call myself a positive economist, meaning I like to deal in the facts. I'm not a normative in saying this is what people should do. I'd rather be in the world of saying, if this is the policy, these are the implications of that policy. But I don't think anybody in the economics world, I don't think anybody in society wants to be in a place to say, we don't want to be in a situation where we tell people in various parts of the world, you don't get to develop.
Right.
You don't get to advance your standard of living. Your children don't get to be better off than you are today. Nobody wants that. They don't want it for themselves, and nobody wants that for somebody else on the other side of the world.
And as you started the conversation with, energy and consumption of energy is directly tied to development, and it has been and it will continue to be. So I think your conclusion that essentially we are underinvesting in the global energy sector is a really important one. And so our sphere of influence here at the School of Energy Resources and the University of Wyoming, for better or for worse, is not the whole world. We would love that. But is there anything that you would tell folks here in Wyoming, here at the University of Wyoming, a land grant institution of one of the largest energy producing states in the nation? What recommendations do you have for us? What should we work on? What can we do to try to alleviate maybe not the underinvestment, but try to come up with some sort of solution that's going to help stem these energy crises that you're alluding to, that we're essentially as a world setting ourselves up for in the future? What can we do to help?
I think there's one or two things. One, keep being pragmatic. The world needs pragmatism, just like the world needs more cowboys.
Yep.
The world needs pragmatism, and it's fine to have an aspiration, but then you need to step back and say, let's be very pragmatic about how do I achieve the aspiration. So when I say be pragmatic, I'm not saying don't have an aspiration that is beyond the pale. Have that aspiration, but then step back and say, what are the pragmatic steps I have to take to get from where I am today to achieving that aspiration? The other thing, I think Wyomingites are just pragmatic people. It's why I keep coming back. I just love coming back home because people here are just so real. So keep being pragmatic. And the other one is keep showing the world it doesn't have to be this way. It can be different. So you think about coal to hydrogen, and if you're going to do that through carbon sequestration, forget about the nettering nabobs of negativism, to quote Spiro Agnew. Park those voices and don't listen to those voices. Show the world that you actually can capture and sequester and contain carbon. There's a lot of skeptics out there that say it can't be done. Use the engineering and the science. And that's the greatest gift I think the University of Wyoming can give to the state of Wyoming and to the world, is to show people this actually can be done. Really smart people can solve really complicated problems. That's the history of engineering. I'm not an engineer, but that's the history of engineering. really smart people solving really hard problems. Sometimes, I think to the detriment of engineers, they make it look really easy.
Yeah.
And people forget how complex these problems are because the solutions are so elegant. But those would be my recommendation. Keep being pragmatic and keep showing the world that it doesn't have to be this way.
On a different topic, and I thank you so much for all that insight into the global energy system. And I love your recommendations. And I completely agree with you on everything you said about Wyoming and what we can contribute and why it's so great to be here. And on a different topic, you've given both your time and your treasure, and thank you for your support, to the University of Wyoming, including the School of Energy Resources. And you have a personal passion and a passion project for helping students, particularly in the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences, to understand strategy and corporate strategy. Personally, I've learned this the hard way, essentially going through an undergrad and a PhD in chemical engineering and then ending up at corporate and kind of having to figure out what strategy was on the fly. And by the way, it is not as black and white as everything you learn in your time learning to be an engineer in college. I really wish I would have had access to a course like the one you're teaching. I hope that I would have been mature enough to understand how important it was. I'm not 100% sure I would have. So kudos to any students who take your class because they're really looking for it. But can you talk about why you're so passionate about this and what these students in the College of Engineering and Physical Sciences are learning in your course?
Yeah, so I think the passion comes back from, in so many organizations, strategy is something you do whenever there's a new CEO and you put a bunch of effort into coming up with a new strategy, and then you take the notebook and put it on the shelf and go back to running the business as it was. And so tends to not have an impact. Strategy tends to be confused with having a 5-year business plan.
Yep.
And the third thing is, if you only do it every time you change out a CEO, it tends to be done by people who aren't very good at it because they don't do it very often. It's a skill set, and if you don't use the skill, it atrophies. So what I'm trying to do the class is largely taken by either seniors or graduate students who are about to graduate with their master's degree. So they're about to step out of their academic lives and start their professional careers. And it's really kind of a discussion with them around why corporations do what they do. When I mentor young people in operating companies I've worked in, there's a lot of, I don't understand why we've made this decision. And there is a reason for it. It's just because we're not very good at strategy, we're also not very good at explaining strategy, and we're not very good at explaining the decisions that we make from that strategy. So there's a bit of this walking them through why corporations make the decisions they do and how they make them. More importantly, as an employee, how those decisions get made. So we'd walk them through trying to turn them into corporate board members in a semester and give them that experience. And one of the big learnings for them is that their entire academic career, they've largely been in a world in which term papers that are longer are better than term papers that are shorter. Then they get into the professional world, and what they learn is that memos need to be short and concise and to the point. What's the insight? Why am I reading this? And that's a bit of a different mindset for them. And what's really fun is to watch them go through that evolution. The first paper has a longer length, but with every subsequent paper they write, we shorten it. We don't lengthen it. We shorten it and sort of force them into being, back to what we talked about earlier, being much more pragmatic and concise about what's the message. And at the end of the semester, they all write a strategy paper, and then the entire class turns into the board of directors. And they present that paper to the board, including the Q&A. I had no idea. I actually remember the first time I taught is at the end of the very first lecture, I kept talking about the board of directors, the board of directors. And I said, are there any questions? And this young woman meekly raises her hand and she says, "What's a board of directors?"
That is where I would have been at that age and at that point in my life as well. So.
That was a teachable moment for me because I've just been in that for so long. It never occurred to me that there could be people who don't know what the term board of directors means.
Yeah.
And by the end of the semester, that same woman was kind of like, I think I want to be on a board someday.
Yeah.
And I was like, well, good for you that you went through this process and you've got an idea of something you want. It would have been just as acceptable to say, now that I've gone through this class, I never want to be on a board of directors.
Yeah.
Because now at least you know. It's the, what you don't know. now she's got something that she would like to do at some point in her life. And I did sort of say, that's great, but it's probably 20 or 30 years down the road for you, because that's just kind of how the process works. People don't end up on the board of directors 6 months after joining the corporation that they're working for. So just kind of set your expectations appropriately. But, I'm happy that she went from not knowing what a board of directors is to potentially wanting to be on the board of directors at some point in her career. And I thought, I declared victory that day. And that's what we tried to do. A lot of that course is just try to get them to think their way through. And also, it's not just thinking about like a board of directors. It goes back to the strategy question of just, you can do strategy work even on a non-strategic problem. Strategy is actually a framework. It's a problem-solving framework more than it is an answer. And so the framework we were always using, we looked across a number of them, different frameworks you can use in the class. But the one we kept coming back to is by Roger Martin, teaches in a business school in Canada. And he said a strategy answers 3 very simple questions. Where do we play? How do we win? What capabilities do we need? He said, if you can't answer those 3 questions, you don't have a strategy.
Yeah.
If you can't answer those, you got the hope that you've got a strategy. But then what you put on top of it is, oh, by the way, before we even ask those questions, the very first thing we need to state is, what's our aspiration? What are we trying to achieve? Once we've defined what we're trying to achieve, now we ask those 3 questions. And when we come up with something that answers those questions and is in service of that aspiration, now you have a strategy. Boy, is it way easier to communicate now to the rest of the organization.
Yeah.
Because it's really kind of crystallized. And now what you then challenge every person in the organization is, now you need to go and form your strategy. Given that this is what the aspiration is, and this is the approach we're going to take, what can you do? What's on your desk that's in service of the strategy? And just as importantly, what's on your desk that's not in service of the strategy? Because quite often, the best strategic answer is, we're not doing this.
That's so great. And your passion for this area really comes through. So thank you so much for teaching that class and for helping our students to have access to that. So for our last question, we love to ask kind of a different toned question and let our listeners learn a little bit more about you. So what's one thing you'd like folks to know about Skip York that we have not talked about?
I've just had a really fortunate life. I've seen a lot of things I never envisioned that I would have seen until I saw them. My dissertation professor, sponsor at the University of Virginia, and it applies to the University of Wyoming as well, but I defended my dissertation and we were walking out of the room and he said, well, do you feel any different? And I was like, well, no, I don't feel any different. And he stopped me and put his hand on my shoulder and he said, someday you're going to be in a room and you're going to look around and say, I'm only in this room because I have a PhD from the University of Virginia. And he said, when that moment happens, pause and embrace that moment. And I think I've had those moments not just because of the PhD from UVA, but also my undergraduate and graduate degrees from Wyoming. They all put together, they were all stepping stones that just kind of led me on this fantastic journey through the energy space. Well, I get people saying, well, when are you going to retire? And I was like, well, I don't know. I don't know what that actually means. But I have 2 things left to do. So I tell, I have a friend that's a music theater major, and she likes to describe everything musically. And she said, you have 2 symphonies left to write. One symphony is, how does the energy transition actually work? So how do you come up with a business model that makes these new energy systems viable, that you can attract the appropriate amount of investment that you need to make that transition possible? That's sort of a professional one. The other symphony I want to write is, I still want to own a minor league baseball team.
Oh, wow. Cool.
So I played baseball as a kid. I didn't realize how bad I was at playing baseball as a kid until I watched my boys play. And I was like, wow, I was never I was never that good. And they both had phenomenal baseball careers, and they both loved the sport. And I've come back to love the sport. And if I could figure out a way, I feel like I want to give back into the strategy space. I want to give back to the University of Wyoming. I don't know what I'd give back to baseball. Has given me more than I'll ever be able to give it. But if there's anybody out there that's ever looking to sell a minor league baseball team at a very steep discount, kind of let me know, because I just think I would love doing that.
Okay.
So,
well, that's an unusual one. No one's ever said that before. And you can be found on LinkedIn, Harold Skip York, right? So if you have a team on the market, then you may have a potential customer here. So Skip, thank you so much for all you do for School of Energy Resources, for the University of Wyoming, for our students. And thank you so much for being here today. Really appreciate your time.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Energy Frontier, the Wyoming Landscape, the podcast that highlights the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. You can expect a new episode of Energy Frontier every Wednesday on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.